I still remember that subtle, thick, and spicy smell of chocolate cake that morning, when the light of the early sun barely touched our clouded windows, filling the kitchen with a golden mist, which was filled with the scent of something unusual, something that had never happened in our house before, even on such rare days. Moments of joy, like Thanksgiving or Christmas. My mother, who has remained a woman completely devoid of culinary talents all my life, a person for whom the kitchen has always been more a place for running for scissors to hastily cut coupons from milk bags or newspaper scraps than an arena of creativity or warmth, suddenly found herself at the stove. And before we continue, write in the comments from which city you are watching this video. Enjoy watching. And yet that day she baked a cake. And I, stupid, naive, blinded by this sudden outburst of concern, did not realize then that behind this fragrance, behind this strange manifestation of culinary inspiration, there was something more, something that would change my life forever. I had just turned 18, an age that should have been marked by a sense of freedom, accomplishment, and something bright, and I was still wandering around the house in my old, long, faded gray pajamas, my hair pulled haphazardly into a bun that seemed about to crumble at the slightest movement. I had barely made it downstairs when Dad, sitting in his usual position in a leather armchair, called me into the living room in a low, almost distant voice. He sat as if rooted to his chair, as if the leather upholstery had wrapped around him, preventing him from rising, and his eyes, usually lively and attentive, were lowered, staring at the floor, and did not rise for a moment to meet my gaze. Mom was sitting next to me on the edge of the couch, her hands clasped in her lap so tightly that her knuckles turned white, and she also stubbornly avoided looking at me. There were no smiles, no warm light in his eyes, no jokes that usually start the morning of a birthday, just a thick, oppressive silence, so dense that it seemed you could touch it with your hands. A long, heavy and suffocating silence enveloped us, and it seemed as if time had stopped. "Sit down," Dad finally said, and his voice was so quiet and cold that it reminded me of that evening in 6th grade when I accidentally broke a lamp in the cafeteria, and instead of shouting, he pronounced the punishment so calmly that I felt more scared than if he had screamed. I obeyed without protest, slowly sinking onto the edge of the couch, clutching the hem of my pajama shirt in my trembling hands, as if looking for some kind of support in this gesture. I felt every cell in my body tense in anticipation of a blow, invisible but inevitable. Everything I knew, everything that was the foundation of my life, was about to change, and this feeling beat in my temples with a throb of panic. Mom broke the silence first. Her voice sounded strained, every word seemed to be called up by an effort of memory, as if she had memorized this text for many nights in a row, repeating it in a whisper in the dark. "You were adopted," she said. I froze. Everything in me seemed to stop in an instant. I didn't blink, I didn't sigh, even my heart seemed to decide to pause so as not to disturb this terrible silence. My ears buzzed, and the surrounding sounds seemed to disappear. "We brought you home when you were almost 3, Dad added, and his words cut through the air like a knife. He spoke quickly, evenly, without looking at me, as if reading an excerpt from an old report. "Your own mother couldn't take care of you," he continued, and I just pressed myself deeper into the couch, feeling the world around me lose its shape. "We did everything we could," their voices intertwined, without emotion, sounding like a dry official statement. I swallowed hard, feeling a dry pain in my throat, and my gaze clung to the endless threads of the carpet, just not to look up at my parents. No hugs, no tears, no desire to ease my pain, just steady voices telling me the terrible news, as if about a change in the interest rate at the bank. "It's time for you to go your own way," Mom said. Her voice was steady, without tremor, but also without warmth, as if she was saying something she had long been disappointed in. Dad leaned forward, reached under the armchair where the old magazines and dusty toys of my childhood used to lie, and pulled out a small canvas bag. He pushed her towards me, and she fell to the floor with a thud, turning out to be heavier than I expected. "Some money. Some clothes. We've booked you a temporary motel room," he added, and every word felt like a punch in the chest. I was kicked out. On my 18th birthday. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. Slowly, as if driven by some inner inertia, I stood up and looked at them with a calm, icy expression on my face, the same face that I had been developing for so long over the years of living in a house where silence was valued above all emotions. "Thank you," I said softly and clearly, then picked up the bag, trying not to show how tightly my fingers gripped the strap. They didn't notice. They didn't even understand. They didn't know that I already knew everything. Because 3 weeks ago, I found something they never expected. That night, as I sat in the dark with a cup of instant coffee, rummaging through old records to fill out endless scholarship application forms, I opened the dusty closet in the upstairs hallway, where tax returns, insurance, and old bank documents had been stored for years. At the very bottom, under a heavy, dreary stack of folders, I felt an old, faded yellow envelope sealed in a careless but intricate handwriting with the inscription, "For L. Wexler." I didn't know who it was, but when I opened it, I felt my heart stop. Inside was a copy of my birth certificate. My name was still there, Jody Monroe. But in the mother line, there was a name I'd never seen before, Madison Wexler. There was a blank in the father column. I was sitting on the cold floor, clutching the certificate to my chest, and my heart was pounding so hard in my chest that it seemed like its pounding could wake up the whole house. Madison Wexler. Who is she? I spent the next 3 weeks searching. I didn't tell anyone about my findings in this house. Only I and the internet were my companions in this silent investigation. I read everything I could about Madison Wexler, absorbing every crumb of information as if my future depended on her, and at one point it seemed to me that I could literally hear the rustle of yellowed pages as my eyes ran through old articles posted on the electronic resources of the city library, where time seemed to stand still, preserving the memory of long-gone events. Very old, but still accessible, they were gathering dust somewhere in the corners of the archives, as if waiting for someone like me to pull the thread of a forgotten scandal in order to unravel the tangle in which my mother's fate had once been mired. The news reported that Madison was a psychological researcher at a neurotherapy center located in a quiet, leafy northern suburb, where high walls and manicured lawns hid a far from idyllic picture of scientific experiments, whose ruthless essence could shock even the coldest skeptics. There was a major scandal that shook the neighborhood, breaking through the boundaries of the medical community, when Madison dared to accuse the director of the center, claiming that serious violations of ethics and legality had been committed during the experimental treatment of women. Soon after her bold move, the consequences followed. Madison was detained for, as was recorded in the official reports, unbalanced behavior, and without lengthy proceedings was sent to a psychiatric institution with the euphonious name Maplewood Hills, where, among the well-groomed alleys and deliberately cozy buildings, as I guessed, those who were too uncomfortable to remain at large were hidden. At this point, all the notes stopped, disappeared into the fog of oblivion, as if someone had deliberately cleaned up every subsequent page of her life. No new photos, no updates, not a single mention of her name after 2004, as if the whole world conspired to erase her existence from history. The more I read, the colder it became inside, as if with each new line someone was opening up an abyss in front of me, into which I inevitably fell. I didn't know if she was still alive, if Madison Wexler existed somewhere out there, beyond the walls of my little world, or if she had long since become a shadow that disappeared without a trace. I'd never heard her name mentioned in our house, in the sparse conversations that sometimes broke through the wall of silence. But the question that kept me awake at night, twisting in my head like a splinter, was one that it seemed no one could ever give me an answer to. Why did I, an ordinary girl from the suburbs, turn out to be the daughter of an informant, adopted by two people whose financial connections led directly to that very neurotherapeutic the center she exposed? My 18th birthday was not the day I lost my family, because, as I now realize, I never had one in the full sense of the word. It was the day when I realized that everything I believed in, my whole life, was built on carefully thought-out lies. I left the house I had lived in for 15 years without looking back, without allowing myself the slightest regret. That suburban house with its white porch and neat, always tightly closed shutters, behind which, as I now realized, uncomfortable secrets were hidden, was not my native place, but just a decoration in a play in which I played a role without the right to choose. The motel where they had booked a room for me was located next to the highway. The eternal vibration of passing cars reverberated in the walls, and the floor was covered with a damp carpet with a pungent smell of cheap bleach and musty air that could not be ventilated even with the window wide open. I couldn't sleep that night. My body, tired to the point of pain, refused to obey, and my thoughts raced in a vicious circle. My canvas bag stood by the bed like a mute witness to my exile. It contained only 2 outfits, some small change resting in my pocket, and the yellow envelope I'd been hiding for weeks, the only really valuable thing I had left. Early the next morning, before the sun had even fully risen above the horizon, I left the motel and went to the city library, the only place in the world where I felt safe, protected by age-old walls overflowing with the whispers of other people's lives and stories. I sat down at the public computer, my hands still shaking, but I forced myself to type Madison Wexler on the keyboard, feeling anxiety brewing in my chest. This time, I dug deeper, not limited to banal news articles or public records. I dived into digital archives, documents leaked online, reports forgotten by someone, and posts on investigative journalism forums. And then a new name began to pop up next to my mother's name, Dr. Colin Harrow, a man who was listed in old documents as the former medical director of a private medical institution called the Harrow Institute for Integrated Mental Health. According to the documents found on March 20, 2004, Madison was a leading specialist at this institution until she filed an internal report on egregious violations, unethical practices, including unauthorized drug testing on women without official guardians and deep behavioral interventions without their consent. A week after submitting the report, she was suspended from work, and a month later she was forcibly admitted to Maplewood Hills Hospital for long-term observation, as stated in the faceless papers. Her notes disappeared, her name was deleted from all documents, as if she had never existed. I printed out everything I could find, my fingers gripping the sheets of paper so tightly that they almost tore before I put them in my coat pocket. On the way back to the motel, I suddenly remembered the letters that Greg Monroe, the man I called Dad all my life, regularly received in envelopes with the inconspicuous logo of an organization called the Vail Foundation. I always thought it was charity, some kind of harmless help, but now the same name has popped up in a footnote of one of the articles I just printed. It turned out that the Vail Foundation was a private foundation that supported the Harrow Institute from 2000 until its closure in 2005, financing the very experiments that had driven my mother into exile. My blood froze in my veins. Was Greg just a foster father who had lost touch with reality, or was he just one of the cogs in a huge, monstrous system, part of the very network that had destroyed my mother's life and was now trying to destroy mine? I picked up government donation records, going through endless tables and summaries, hoping to find at least some thread that would connect Greg Monroe to the world he carefully kept silent about, and my heart sank when I saw his name in the donor report for 2011. Gregory Monroe was listed as an outstanding benefactor of the Vail Foundation, marked special contribution to post-recovery support programs, and this phrase made my stomach turn cold, as if icy water had poured into my chest. He, a man who never talked about therapy, who, as far as I knew, had never visited a hospital or shown the slightest interest in healthcare, had been donating money over the years to a foundation directly linked to the place where, as it now became obvious, my real mother was locked up. There was no more doubt, no more room for naive excuses or illusions. They knew Greg and his wife, the same woman who held my little hand in hers when I was sick and delirious with fever, the one who helped me choose my prom dress, stroking my shoulder in the fitting room, with a smile that now seemed fake to me. They knew everything, and all the time they were silent, hiding the truth from me, as if sealing it in the dark depths of their prosperous lives. I didn't go back to the motel that night. I couldn't step on that dirty carpet again and breathe in the musty air of loneliness, so I found a small, bright cafe that was open around the clock, took a booth in the farthest corner where no one could see me, and pulled out my old, battered notebook, witness to all my teenage dreams, to write down everything: names, dates, addresses, connections, sketching a map, drawing a network of invisible threads that began to take a frighteningly distinct form. And at the very center of this sinister web stood Madison Wexler, a woman who lost everything to tell the truth, and then was buried under the label of a diagnosis, shut up and forgotten because her truth turned out to be uncomfortable. I didn't know if she was still alive. I didn't know if Maplewood Hills still existed, or if it had been renamed, dissolved, erased, the way you erase spots on an old photograph so that no one would ever remember. But I knew one thing: I had to find out, because the truth, once peeking around the corner, could no longer be driven back into the darkness. I started calling medical registration offices, notary offices, psychiatric institutions in the Harrow area, clinging to every opportunity, every hint, but most answered with a cold no. Some, without bothering with details, simply said that they had no records. But one day, at the end of an endless day, when I was already beginning to lose hope, an elderly woman in the state archive froze when she heard my quiet but insistent Madison Wexler, and after a short, anxious pause, she said, "You're not the first person to ask about her," and then, without adding a word, she hung up the phone. Those words pierced me sharper than any knife. Who was the first? Did they find Madison? Or did they disappear too, like her? I didn't know what I was getting myself into, step by step delving into a story intertwined with lies and betrayal, but now everything was clear. It wasn't just about my personality, it wasn't just about finding my roots, now it was about my mother, who was silenced, and the truth, which I was full of. Determination to reveal, despite fear and doubt. It took me almost 2 weeks to track down the tracks of Maplewood Hills, which turned out to be closed in 2010, disappearing from the map so thoroughly that on most modern navigators its place was marked as a gray, unnamed piece of land, as if nature itself tried to erase the memory of this place. There was no website, no publicly available files, no public information, just silence. But perseverance was rewarded. An old post on a forgotten forum about anomalies in psychiatric care gave me a new clue. They said that the Clearhaven Rehabilitation Center accepted special transfers after the closure of Maplewood Hills, and the one I was looking for could be hiding in these displaced destinies. I called Clearhaven from an old pay phone on the corner of an abandoned parking lot, carefully using a prepared fake name, a pre-made legend, and my heart was pounding so hard that I could barely breathe. The secretary, with her usual politeness and official detachment, immediately informed me that she could not share patient information, but I noticed how her voice froze for a split second when I said the name, Madison Wexler. She told me to wait, and the silence that hung on the phone seemed like an eternity before the call was transferred to another woman, whose voice sounded calm but careful, as if every phrase was being weighed by her on the scales of consequences. "What is your attitude towards Miss Wexler?" she asked without the slightest pause, and I gritted my teeth and blurted out, "I'm her daughter." Silence, a long, 10-second silence in which I could only hear my own breathing, seemed to freeze between us before she finally spoke again. "You can visit her, but only for limited hours, and you will have to sign a no-record agreement." I immediately agreed, without hesitation, feeling like my whole life was changing rapidly, as if it was going off the rails. The next morning, when the city was just beginning to wake up, I boarded the first bus at 6:15, heading to the northern suburbs, to a place that seemed to be hiding from the world all this time. Clearhaven turned out to be located on a foggy hillside, isolated so much that it seemed to have been deliberately forgotten, hidden, and crossed off the memory map. The main building was built of old gray stone. Its walls were entangled with dry, dead ivy, like a net that kept prisoners inside, and the entrance was shaded by tall pine trees, which made the air saturated with the aroma of raw wood and harsh antiseptic smells that chilled to the shudder. At the reception desk, they gave me a short form to sign without further ado, and after making sure that all the formalities were followed, they called upstairs. "Room 14, second floor." "Just 15 minutes, the woman behind the counter said, and my heart hit my ribs with such force that I was afraid it would burst out. My heart began to beat so hard that it seemed to echo down the corridor as I approached a white wooden door with a worn handle, which hid the truth for which I had come all this way, and without giving myself time to doubt, I grabbed the cold metal handle, took a deep breath of the damp, smelly air. I antiseptic the air and gently pushed the door forward, feeling every nerve in my body tremble. She was sitting there, a thin woman with snow-white hair that framed her haggard face, which was etched with more pain than I could have imagined. She was standing by the window, where the faint rays of the morning sun penetrated through the transparent curtains, casting thin, wavering shadows on a stack of faded books spread out in a room so quiet that I could hear not only the echo of my footsteps, but also the hum of my own heartbeat in my ears. I barely dared to whisper, "Miss Madison," for fear of breaking that fragile silence, and then she slowly, as if overcoming an invisible weight, turned to me, and our eyes met, dark brown, deep, full of bitterness and sadness. But despite everything that had happened to her, in her there was still something faintly resembling recognition, hope, that flickering spark that I desperately wanted to cling to, even though I wasn't sure if it belonged to me. She didn't look away, and I, overcoming the fear that gripped me, stepped forward and sank into the chair opposite her, feeling a shiver run through my body as I spoke. "My name is Jody." My voice trembled treacherously, as if every letter had been torn from the very depths of my soul. "You had a daughter 18 years ago." Tears, thick and heavy, welled up in her eyes, giving them shine, but none of them rolled down her cheek. She blinked, then nodded slowly, very slowly, and her voice, barely audible but distinct, like a jagged knife, pierced my heart. "I remember. I've never forgotten." I pulled out of my jacket pocket a copy of my birth certificate and the printed articles I had collected in the library, and without saying a word, I placed them on the table between us, as if leaving in front of her evidence that I had found her, that I knew the truth, that I understood. She did not leave me voluntarily. "I found everything," I said, barely able to contain my sobs. "I know you didn't leave me. They took me away." She exhaled with such relief that it seemed as if a whole world of pain and fear, which she had been carrying for almost 2 decades, had burst out of her chest, and at that moment I realized how much she had gone through alone, how long she had been silent under the pressure of lies. After long moments, when it seemed to me that time had frozen, she spoke again, her voice hoarse but determined. "They said that I was paranoid, that I imagined all this, but I knew too much." I didn't interrupt, giving her the opportunity to speak, giving her the freedom that had been taken away from her so long ago, and she continued, "I gathered evidence. They tested drugs on patients who had no guardians, no unsigned consent forms, no one even knew what was going on. I sent the report to the board. I was suspended a week later, and they took me here a month later." I swallowed a lump in my throat, and looking into her eyes, I said softly, "Greg Monroe. The man who adopted me. Was he involved?" Her body shuddered, not from the cold, but from the very sound of that name, and I saw her face turn even paler, and her fingers gripped the armrest of the chair tighter. "He coordinated the financing," she said. "The Vale Foundation was one of Harrow's defenders. When I was taken away, your case was sealed. I tried to stop them. I signed the objection letters, I screamed, I fought, but then they said that I was no longer capable." I felt my fists clench so hard that my nails dug into my palms, but I didn't pay attention to it, because one question burned my throat, demanding to be uttered. "So he adopted me to hide all this?" Madison nodded slowly, her gaze full of pain and love never leaving mine, and I knew that every word she said would be true. "You are living proof of a buried case of violence. They thought that if I kept you by my side, would be silent forever." I didn't know at what point my eyes filled with tears, at what point they began to roll down my cheeks, but it didn't matter anymore, because at that moment, when Madison hesitantly and uncertainly stretched out her hand to me, I took it without hesitation, thin, cold, but warmer than any hug I've ever known in my entire life. Before I left, when I was about to retreat to the door, the nurse knocked softly on the door jamb, making it clear that my time was up, but I turned around one last time, clutching at this moment with all the strength of my heart. "I'll be back," I promised her. "I'll get you out of here." She didn't respond with words, just nodded, her lips moving in a faint whisper, barely perceptible, and I had to lean closer to hear her warning, "Never trust anyone in a white coat." I left Clear Haven at the very moment when the sky, as if sharing my pain, began to cry rain, not a downpour, but a cold, fine drizzle that pattered on the asphalt and reminded me that time was not on my side. With every step away from this institution, I felt like I was opening a door that could never be closed, and a heavy certainty grew in my chest. Madison, my birth mother, was never crazy. She was a victim, And if I stop now, if I let fear get the better of me, I'll be the next in a long line of silence. A few days later, I returned to where my journey for truth began, to the old library, which I once considered just a quiet refuge among the gray everyday life. But now it has become a sacred place for me to search, where every rustle of pages, every forgotten file held pieces of the truth about the life that was taken from me. I chose the same corner at the far end of the room, sank into a creaking chair and spread out all the files I had collected in recent weeks in front of me again, but this time my eyes were no longer searching for roots, no longer clinging to memories. They were looking ahead, preparing for the real confrontation, which I knew was inevitable. In a pile of faded printouts covered with marginal notes and the marks of my nervous fingers, one name kept coming up, insistent as an echo: Judith Campbell, a former nurse who worked in Maplewood Hills from 1998 to 2010, a woman about whom, in an anonymous message on one of the psychiatric care forums, someone he mentioned that she was the last one who still had the courage to remember and perhaps speak. It took me 3 long days to, almost by touch, among disconnected phone numbers, abandoned mailboxes, and inactive email addresses, finally come across an old mailbox in Michigan that could belong to her, and risking everything I had, I wrote a short, sincere letter. In closing, I sent him a copy of my birth certificate and an article about the Harrow Institute, praying that it would fall into the right hands. I didn't expect an answer. I learned not to expect anything good, but exactly a week later, in my motel, among other advertisements, there turned out to be a simple envelope without a return address, and inside it was a letter in which it was written in a modest but confident handwriting. I know who your mother is. Meet me at the back entrance of the Larkspur Cafe at 10 a.m. on Saturday. Come alone. Without a moment's hesitation, I gathered my files, a notebook, and a yellow envelope and, grabbing all the evidence I could carry, boarded the first morning bus to Michigan. The road through the fog seemed endless, and every clatter of wheels echoed in my head with a heavy foreboding. The Larkspur Cafe turned out to be small, almost invisible, hidden around the corner of an old flea market, where the air was saturated with the smell of roasted coffee and raw wood, and, circling the building, I found an alley where there was a row of sagging wooden benches along the wall and a metal door leading to the basement, the peeling paint of which was peeling off, as if leaving a place for new secrets. She was already waiting for me there, a woman in a dark wool coat, her gray hair neatly combed, her sharp face wary, her eyes strangely intense, studying me before she said without hesitation, "You're Madison's daughter," and there was such confidence in her voice that it took my breath away. She was my colleague, she continued, without taking her eyes off me for a moment, the only one in this whole system who had the courage to tell the truth, and although I was overwhelmed with emotions, I knew that there was no time for tears, because I did not come here to cry, but in order to fight. "I need proof," I said, trying to sound firm, and in response, Judith, without saying a word, unzipped her bag, rummaged inside, and took out an old flash drive with a faded sticker on which the inscription GHT_pilot_1 could barely be made out, and handing it to me, she said, "This is a copy of the treatment records that I stole before I left the facility." She explained that it contained medical journals, patient codes, and a video that Madison had once saved in the hope of using as proof. My fingers trembled as I picked up the flash drive, feeling a mixture of hope and fear twist my stomach. I asked, looking at Judith with a hope I was afraid to voice out loud. "Not yet," she replied, lowering her gaze, "but it's something they won't be able to deny." When I returned to the city, clutching the flash drive in my coat pocket as tightly as if it were my lifeline, I realized that I couldn't do it alone, that I needed someone who could not only collect information, but also make it loud, who knew how to tell the truth so that it couldn't be drowned in the mud of lies. And then one name came to my mind, Mara Reyes, a former investigative journalist whose career collapsed when she tried to solve a case involving shady medical funds, a story that few people remembered now, but traces of which I found in a forgotten personal blog, rarely updated, but filled with revelations of scandals, which others were afraid to touch. I sent her an email with a subject that could have been a cry for help in itself. "I have video footage, internal documents, and the names of those who are holding my mother hostage," and less than an hour later, my phone rang. "Are you kidding?" Mara's voice was deep, dry, like a sharpened knife. and there was a mixture of disbelief and the strange excitement that comes from a person who feels that the story he lived for has suddenly found him. "Such a story cost me my career," she said, and I could hear the hidden pain slip through her words, "but it can bring your name back." There was a tense silence for a moment, and then, as if making an internal decision, Mara said, "I'll meet you tomorrow at 7 p.m. on the 3rd floor. The floor of the old studio. Bring everything and don't bring anyone." The next evening, I entered a dusty room that had once been a bustling newsroom, a space that has now become Mara's archive and a safe haven for those truths that no one else dared to publish, because fear and convenient oblivion have become much more popular companions in our world than the truth. She turned on an old computer, whose dim screen illuminated overflowing shelves of documents and hard drives, and without hesitation, I handed her the disk, as if handing her not just an object, but the last chance to bring justice. When blurry shots of a woman locked in a dark room played on the screen, when the cold voice of a doctor politely, almost affectionately asking about post-injection emotions was heard, and Madison's trembling but distinct answer, in which bottomless fatigue and courage could be heard, Mara's expression changed, her gaze darkened, became sharper, like a hunter's, smelling prey. "We have something real," she said, without taking her eyes off the screen, and I could hear the tension in her voice, as if she were making an unspoken pact with herself at that moment. "But we have to do it right, otherwise people will disappear forever." I stared into her eyes, trying to put into that look all the determination that had been building up in me for weeks, going through sleepless hours night after night, and replied, "If my mom had the courage to stand alone, I can stand up to the storm. We will expose everything, every name, every crime." Mara nodded, briefly, abruptly, as if marking the beginning of a new chapter in a story we were just about to write. And so the battle began, not with bullets, not with fists, but with the light of truth, directed straight into those dark corners that they thought no one would ever dare to touch. We didn't leak anything right away, because Mara was clear and firm. If you want to destroy the system, you don't strike once and run away, you hit from all sides at once, before they have time to come to their senses and restore order, while they still believe in their invulnerability. Over the next 3 weeks, we worked as if time was running out like sand in a clock. Mara contacted 3 former lawyers who had handled medical ethics cases in the past. I sent copies of videos and files to an informant platform that Mara certainly trusted, and Judith, a courageous nurse, agreed to give an official statement, attaching to it an old recording of Madison's voice from one of the therapy sessions, in which you could hear her quiet voice desperately clinging to the truth, despite everything that she had to go through. By April 12, everything was ready. The video was leaked online. A long, detailed article appeared on the homepage of an independent investigative news site. A podcast about unauthorized medical testing of vulnerable women began to gain popularity, and most importantly, the names of Greg Monroe and Colin Harrow were clearly and unambiguously listed on the board of the Vail Foundation. Social media exploded, as if the anger and distrust that had been building up for a long time had finally found a way out. What started as my personal quiet story suddenly turned into a movement. People whose loved ones were once held in Maplewood Hills or Clear Haven began to make statements, one by one. A woman in Portland posted a video showing her mother, helpless and lost, being forced to take trial medications under pressure from staff, and a leaked document revealed that the Vail Foundation had funded a program ominously called Women's Behavioral Recovery, and that phrase sent chills down my spine. 3 days later, the state attorney general announced the launch of an official investigation. Federal authorities intervened, and police raided the offices of the Vail Foundation and Clear Haven, seizing documents and servers. Greg Monroe and Colin Harrow were invited to cooperate, although their lawyers were foaming at the mouth in the press that all the accusations were groundless, and the evidence was taken out of context. But I still had one goal, a goal that burned brighter in my heart than any triumph: to get my mother out before it was too late. We arrived at Clear Haven on an overcast morning, when the sky hung low and leaden, as if time itself had frozen in anticipation. Mara sat at the wheel, focused and gloomy, and next to her was Judith, tightly clutching a folder with documents, our shield and our weapons. I brought everything, evidence that Madison was not just a patient, that she was a victim of betrayal, and that she had a legitimate next of kin who had the right to demand her release. The reception staff hesitated at first, looked back at their superiors, and mumbled something about procedures, but when Mara handed them a copy of the summons from the prosecutor's office, polished with stamps and seals, they realized that it was pointless to object. Within an hour, my mother was led out into the hall, still with the same gray hair, still frail in body, but with eyes that no longer showed fear, only fatigue and incredible courage. I took her hand tightly, I swear I wouldn't let go for anything in the world, and said softly, almost in a whisper, "Let's go home, Mom." Madison didn't ask where, why, or how long we still had to fight. She just smiled at me with that smile that had been waiting for 19 years. To finally blossom in the single most important moment of our lives. We didn't go to the city right away. Judith, caring and practical, had arranged in advance for Madison to temporarily stay at the Center for the Support of Former Informants in the Field of Healthcare, a place where not only they offered therapeutic help and legal protection, but, more importantly, they gave the most valuable thing: respect. At the first court hearing, I sat in the farthest row, in the semi-darkness of the crowded courtroom, feeling the walls seem to move closer with every beat of my heart, and when Greg Monroe entered the courtroom, I barely recognized in this man that quiet, confident father who once forced me to finish eating the hated vegetables at the dinner table. Now there was no confidence in his gait, and in his eyes. When he looked directly at me, I saw not guilt, as I expected, but fear, a living, all-consuming fear that washed over me like a cold wave, proving that they knew their end was near. The prosecutor opened the trial by presenting the first evidence, and when the video footage of Madison's interrogation in a locked room played on the screen, where her face was confused, trembling, and scared, there was such silence in the hall that it seemed as if you could hear the ice cracking under your feet. Then, one by one, the prosecutor presented the unapproved medication logs, internal reports that were not supposed to see the light of day, each of which was signed by the names I now know, Monroe and Harrow, and with each new document, I felt like masks were being removed from these people, exposing the ugly truth they so desperately wanted. They tried to hide it. When the prosecutor said my name, Jody Monroe, a girl illegally adopted during an internal investigation in order to hide an informant, someone in the audience gasped, and in the dead silence that followed, I distinctly heard a pen fall to the floor with a thud from one of the journalists. Mara, who was sitting next to me, gently squeezed my shoulder. Her touch was strong and warm, like a shield, and, bending down, she whispered, "You did what they thought was impossible. You have destroyed the silence on which they built everything." I didn't cry, not because I was strong, but because I knew that allowing myself to be weak now would mean stopping, and I couldn't stop anymore. A few weeks after the first hearing, when the court records were still filling the local newspapers, I received an anonymous letter through a secure account. It was short, but its contents chilled my heart. It said, "You're not the first, but you're the first to survive," and a single name was attached to the letter: Rebecca Harlow, a former journalism student who, as it turned out, tried to investigate the Maplewood case and disappeared without a trace in 2012. I always thought that Claire Rothman was the only one who ever dared to touch on this forbidden topic, but now it became clear there were others, even more stories, even more truths buried under the weight of lies and fear. I sent back a short message asking for a meeting, and just a day later I received a photo. It was of a woman with short hair, glasses, and a wary but lively look. It was Rebecca, and she was alive, now living in Nebraska under a new name, hiding but still existing despite everything. A month passed after the first hearing, when I was sitting with Madison in a small, cozy cafe on the outskirts of the city, which smelled of fresh pastries and roasted coffee, and for the first time in all this time I saw her effortlessly raising a cup of black coffee without sugar and cream to her lips. For the first time her smile was soft, she was relaxed, not a strained mask, but a real, lively one, and although there were still traces of fatigue on her face, her eyes were different. Bright, even, filled with gentle strength. She carefully turned the ceramic cup in her hands, looking out the window, and without taking her eyes off the peaceful picture behind the glass, she said softly, "Back then, I thought no one would believe me. Nobody. Everything they did was aimed at making women like me look unstable." I nodded, feeling my throat tighten with pain for her, for all those who were silenced, for all the stolen lives. In those years, my mother lost not only her voice, but they took away her identity, turned her into a complicated case, into a medical anomaly, although her only fault was that she dared to speak openly. We didn't talk about Greg Monroe anymore. After he was officially charged with 3 charges: abuse of power, falsifying records, and illegally interfering with the adoption process, he disappeared from the news as suddenly as he appeared there. His lawyer, of course, continued to deny everything he could, but the evidence Judith provided was saved emails and an audio recording of Greg's voice speaking, "Leave the child to shut up," were irrefutable and merciless. Colin Harrow also did not escape the consequences. His medical license was revoked, and the federal investigation expanded to cover all the institutions he supervised over the past 10 years. People who had been silent for years out of fear began to talk. Some were former patients, others were their relatives, and others were former colleagues who had once been too scared to ask questions, but now they found each other on forums, in support groups, and more importantly, in public disclosure. Documents exposing the entire web of lies. Mara, who stood next to me every step of the way, refused to return to television when she was invited to talk about our case on national air, and when I asked her why, she just smiled tiredly and said, "I didn't do it to be the center of attention. I did this so that girls like you wouldn't have to walk through the dark alone." She agreed to only one thing: to record an exclusive podcast where the story would be told in our voices, mine, Judith's, Madison's, and finally, the one I never thought I'd find again, Rebecca Harlow, the very woman whose name was once whispered at the hearing, whose fate remained for me for a long time. Just a grim guess. She contacted me herself when she heard that her name had resurfaced on the surface of a forgotten story, like a beacon for those who had remained in the shadows all this time, and in her first email, short as a heartbeat, there was only one line. I didn't have time to finish then, but I didn't give up. We met at a community center in Denver, in a shabby building full of the smell of coffee and cheap disinfectants, a place that was perfect for 2 women keeping stories that others would rather forget. Rebecca lived under a new name, and even though her hair was shorter and her glasses hid attentive, cautious eyes, there was still an indomitable will in her appearance. She kept everything: old documents, notes of handwritten letters, copies of Madison's medical reports, which were sent to human rights organizations. She told me how she was threatened, how her laptop was stolen once, and how her bank account was frozen, hoping to silence her. But she survived. And now, like us, she decided to come out into the light. We founded a group called Silence Breakers, a non-profit organization that supports victims who were illegally placed in institutions, called Unstable, simply because they dared to tell the truth. We provided legal resources and mental health support, but most importantly, we created a space where everyone could be truly heard, without shame, without fear. The media called us a quiet revolution in the field of mental health, admired our courage, but for me it was just another step on the long road to justice, to redemption, not only for my mother, but also for hundreds of other women, just like her, those who were broken by the system. I still keep the original of my birth certificate in the secret pocket of my coat, not to remind myself who I am, not to stir up old pain, but to never forget where I came from, what price I had to pay for the truth. I was once treated like a shadow, a being who was robbed of the right to the truth, treated blindfolded, as a thing that could be lied to, manipulated, used, but I left this world, not just to survive, but to act. When someone once asked me if I regretted starting all this, that I went against the people who once called me a daughter, against the system that once gave me a roof over my head, I answered without hesitation, I didn't ignite anything. I just revealed the truth that they were trying to bury. And now my mother, Madison, lives in a small apartment near the coast, where every day begins not with pills and interrogations, but with watering flowers on the balcony, reading books, and writing letters to former Clear Haven patients, whom she helps to reintegrate into society, supporting them with words the way she once did. No one supported me. One day, when I came to visit her, I found a folded piece of paper on the kitchen table, neat, almost ceremonial. Inside was a short, handwritten line, "You're the only reason I didn't give up." I didn't respond with words, didn't cry, didn't collapse into her arms, as is often shown in the movies. I just folded the piece of paper back and put it in my wallet, in the same place where our photo was kept, taken on the day when she finally left Clear Haven, free. We didn't say anything that day. There were no pretentious speeches. There were no solemn promises. We just held hands, and for the first time in our lives we stepped through the open gates together, into a new world where silence finally ceased to be an instrument of oppression and became a symbol of freedom. My story is not just about how I searched for my birth father or tried to regain my lost name. This is a story about how to reclaim the truth, find yourself among the wreckage of lies, and how, as a girl who was kicked out of the house with only a canvas bag and smeared with the shadows of the past, to rise up and become a voice for those who were silenced for decades. I am no longer Jody Monroe, the child they tried to hide and forget. I have become a voice determined to rise up, to become a shield for those who were being silenced. And for me, this is real freedom.